Hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining. Can see you all coming in on the tab at the side, so we'll just wait a few minutes for everybody to join and get their audio sorted. Can see all of you coming in now, so thank you very much for joining us and choosing to spend your Tuesday evening with us tonight. We'll just wait a second or so for everybody's Zooms to load, and then we will get started. Right, I think we can kick off now. Hello everybody and welcome to our Young Fabians Environment Network event on designing sustainable cities. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're going to be discussing how we can make our urban environments livable for future generations. I'm delighted to be joined by our guest speaker, Cllr Tom Hayes, Deputy Leader of Oxford City Council and Cabinet Member for Green Transport and Zero Carbon Oxford. I'll give Tom a proper introduction in more detail shortly. My name is Laura Cunliffe-Hall and I'm Communications Officer for the Young Fabians Environment Network. A bit of information about the Young Fabians for those of you that might not be familiar with the work that we do. The Young Fabians is a youth branch of the Fabian Society. Fabian Society is Britain's oldest left-wing think tank that facilitates member debate and activism across the UK and engages in policy at all levels to positively influence political decision making. We've been doing a lot of Zoom events throughout the lockdown and beyond. At the moment, we're running a series of in-depth policy projects on areas including AI, devolution, widening access to politics, and holding international governments and corporations to account on climate change. Tonight's event is themed around designing sustainable cities. Across the globe, our towns and cities are being reshaped as global leaders and urban planners are implementing changes such as wider pavements, traffic restrictions, increased infrastructure tailored specifically towards pedestrians and cyclists. These are home to 55% of the world's population and have always been hub spots for new ideas, and are currently places where many new techniques to reduce the impacts of climate change, pollution, resource use, and biodiversity loss are now taking shape. We're going to be discussing the environmental benefits of active travel, pedestrianisation, road space reallocation, and how this can lead to improved urban resilience. A bit of housekeeping in terms of how we're going to structure tonight's event. We'll kick off with an introduction, after which I'm going to ask Tom some questions. Then we'll open it up to the floor for a Q&A later on in the session. Please, if you can pop any of your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom, that would be great, and we can get round to asking your question to Tom later on. You can also ask a question anonymously. This event is being recorded, so it will be uploaded onto the Young Fabians YouTube channel, and we're currently live on Facebook. So please feel free to share the link in the chat with anyone that you think will be interested. I'd now like to formally introduce our speaker, Cllr Tom Hayes, who's very kindly agreed to be here with us tonight. Tom is Deputy Leader of Oxford City Council and Cabinet Member for Green Transport and Zero Carbon Oxford. Tom is an elected City Councillor for St Clement's Ward in East Oxford, first elected to the City Council in 2014, then re-elected in 2018. Tom's role involves him leading the development of the Council's journey to zero carbon and related partnerships to achieve a carbon neutral Oxford. At the start of 2019, Oxford City Council unanimously declared a climate emergency. Following this, the Council decided to become the first UK city to hold a citizens' assembly on the issue, the Oxford Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change. The Council responded to the Assembly's demands and outlined a 19 million climate emergency budget, which Tom has described as part of the Council's efforts to set a new course, taking the city towards zero carbon while ensuring this does not sacrifice residents' living standards or disadvantage low-income households. Previously, Tom has worked for the mental health charity Restore, the global humanitarian aid charity Oxfam, and the disability charity Scope. Tom is also the chief executive of a mental health, complex needs and domestic abuse charity. Tom, before we go more in depth into our discussion about making our cities more sustainable, I'd like to kick off my round of questions by asking you first and foremost, what made you want to go into politics and what sparks your interest in environmental activism in particular?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for the invitation by the Young Fabians. It's brilliant to be here with you tonight. The reason that I wanted to be involved in politics was quite narrow, actually. It was to be involved in Labour Party politics. I grew up in Salford in Greater Manchester on a council estate which was run down very heavily by the Tories and Thatcher in the 80s and the 90s. The school that I went to wasn't a direct beneficiary of the Labour government's investments by the time I'd left. It was after I'd left, so my school was really struggling. I had to put myself through university working low-paid jobs. I worked a combination of waiting on tables and private boxes at a local arena in Manchester. If you're interested, David Beckham gives the best tips. He will give you £20 for doing zero work and ordering nothing. Probably a bit more now, it's 20 years on. And I also worked as what was known affectionately by the older members of staff as the toy boy at Woolworths. So I worked those jobs to put myself through university. And for me, politics is about improving people's lives. It's about being true to yourself and serving the cause that you believe in. And I think there's no truer cause than the Labour Party, and there's no truer cause than righting the wrongs of socioeconomic injustice. And that's my entry point for environmental activism. I think for too long we've thought about the green movement as something which belongs to a niche part of society, or something which operates on the margins of political debate. It shouldn't be. And the Citizens' Assembly on climate change that we held in Oxford very directly focused down on that. It's not about the need to pursue policies that decarbonise as rapidly as possible, although it is indeed that. It's about achieving economic and social justice. So the co-benefits of environmental action for social and economic outcomes are clear. Greener homes are healthier, happier homes. A greener transport system will be a more accessible, affordable transport system. So actually, through the green transport and the housing and the other measures we introduce, we can actually achieve the Labour Party programme that we all care about. And I think not just looking at the co-benefits of environmental action, but the other draws into environmental action were largely linked to the Labour government's record. So if you look at the proud record we have on international aid and development, setting up DFID, setting our target into law for a proportion of our income against development spend, all the good that we did to relieve famine and poverty across the developing world. I worked at Oxfam as their head of campaigns. I campaigned on climate. I was part of the campaign which was focusing on the Paris Treaty. And all the way through it, we talked about how actually the poorer members of our world are going to disproportionately bear the burden of climate breakdown. They're the people who've contributed the least to our emissions. So how can we actually make sure that we're doing good and we're serving the international development cause through climate action? And then I think it's also about democracy. I think too often when we talk about climate, we talk about the need to go faster and further, and we sometimes ignore the fact that people need to be consulted. We need to have democracy. And actually, when we have a democracy currently, which is in part in crisis, and we need a new constitutional settlement and a new way of engaging with each other and our politicians, climate breakdown and the solutions we need to find to it are the key ways in which we can reboot our democracy. And with our Citizens' Assembly, we definitely tried to embed a new form of democratic participation. We tried to strengthen what was already a robust local democracy still further. And we looked at trying to find solutions which were at the city level. Because frankly, if you're going to wait for Whitehall and government, you're going to be waiting a very long time. So let's crack on where Labour's in power. Let's crack on in the cities and at local government.
I completely agree with you. And I think the point about sort of making sure that justice is sort of at the heart of everything we're doing, particularly in terms of environmentalism, is really important. We've obviously sort of touched on, you both live in and represent Oxford, which is not only an iconic city in the UK, but also worldwide. And often is inseparable in many people's minds from cycling, with cycling around the city depicted in all forms of popular culture, books, films, TV, from Brideshead Revisited to Mamma Mia 2 most recently. Have you found that the strength of the existing cycling infrastructure in Oxford has meant that there has always been quite a lot of public support for active travel in and around the city, as we experience what Sustrans is calling the 2020 cycling boom?
I definitely think having Meryl Streep in a scene of Mamma Mia on a bike would have done immeasurable benefit to the city's cycling vision and ambitions. I think we could have put that all overboard. There's definitely a moment happening, isn't there? There's a need for people to be able to get around their communities safely. And because we've seen our roads emptied of the vehicles that would dominate them, people feel for the first time comfortable to get onto a bike. Or if they haven't been on a bike for a while, they're feeling comfortable hopping onto a bike. And so some of the transportation measures that we're trying to take forward now are as much about permanently entrenching the reallocation of road space to cycling infrastructure in the future, as it is about continuing to keep vehicles out of the road so that on the existing infrastructure, cyclists feel comfortable getting around our city. We are the second cycling city in Oxford. It's funny, when we held the Citizens' Assembly on climate change, one of the big bugbears of our assembly members was that Cambridge was beating us. They didn't like that we were lagging behind. They actually felt it would be better if we were third or fourth rather than second, because just to be so near and so far was not good enough. So there was a definite injunction from the assembly members, who were recruited by Ipsos Mori to be representative of the city's demography and socioeconomic backgrounds, so they could give that really representative viewpoint. That was really important. So some of the things that we're looking at now is trying to really make some of these infrastructure changes that the government are mandating local authorities to pursue, often with insufficient money. We are not, at the City Council, the Transport Authority. I have to work very closely with rural Tories wearing 3-pin suits and very nice little silk handkerchiefs in their top pockets, who frankly either don't accept that climate breakdown is a problem, or if they do, believe that the city ought not to be receiving investment because they don't win any votes there, and rather they ought to be investing in cycling infrastructure out in the county. And by cycling infrastructure, they mean more roads, which obviously would be dominated by cars. So everything that we do has to be about building the case, acquiring evidence, mobilizing our communities for change. And I think we've really tried hard on that in the time since the lockdown has taken effect. We've held surveys using our Citizens' Assembly and our Citizens' Panel, which is representative, to get a sense of what the city on a broad spectrum is thinking about the transportation change that we want to pursue. We've been really proactive in going out and proposing city centre bus gates that would aim to eliminate the traffic that comes through the city centre, which is largely cut through traffic. So vehicles often used by one individual who will use the city centre as a cut through and not actually stop or spend any money to reboot the local economy and protect jobs, when instead they could use the ring road if they really had to, or they could get onto bikes, or they could get onto buses. And we've had a consultation recently on our 2 proposed bus gates, which saw a whopping 7,000 responses, which is pretty unprecedented. When we had a consultation on our zero emission zone a couple of years ago, which is the zero emission zone due to come into effect in about a year, we had just 900 plus responses. So clearly there's a desire to get involved in the democratic debate. And one of the arguments that we're making for bus gates is that if you can reduce that cut through traffic on your city centre streets, narrow medieval streets that are just not wide enough to accommodate ever increasingly large cars, particularly dominated by just one individual driver, then you can actually free up an awful lot of space for cyclists, and people can feel comfortable getting around. I think one thing that we need to be thinking about is how we future-proof the changes that we're making now. Because actually, if we look 5 or 10 years down the line, it's not just that we have to worry about fossil fuel cars. It may be that fossil fuel cars are replaced by zero emissions cars, in which case you don't have necessarily the air pollution problems or the contribution to climate breakdown, but you still have congestion, which means that you can't use your space for cycling. But then you get into even more of a terrifying place, which is what happens if automation takes off, or rather autonomous vehicles take off on a significant scale. You could have somebody getting into an admittedly zero emissions electric autonomous car, shooting around the narrow streets of Oxford, never parking their car because they can just have it autonomously driving around to avoid car parking charges. And then you could have a city which is constantly in gridlock. this is an opportunity to actually think ahead, future-proof our transport system, make it zero emissions, but also zero congestion.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And I think raised some really important points there, particularly around sort of why active travel itself is so important. The sort of issue at the moment, there's been recent figures from the government's National Travel Attitudes Survey, which showed that 66% of adults in England said it was dangerous for me to cycle on the roads, up from 61% a year before, which is marking the highest figure for more than a decade. Should there be more education around cycling safety, and how can we make choosing the bike over the car, as you mentioned, roads are already super congested, seem a safe and normal rather than a scary option?
Yeah, it very much is, I think, about perception. We know the benefits of cycling. It's great for health, it's great for mental well-being, it's great for the environment, it's great for air quality. It's also a very accessible and more affordable means of travel than the car, which means that, you know, if we are thinking creatively about who we want to be providing bikes to, it could be a really immeasurably powerful tool for doing what the Prime Minister wants to do, which is apparently levelling up. So how do we actually try to really advance the vision for the bike? And it's also not just about the kind of pedal power, it's about electric bikes too. So how can we try to find electric bike infrastructure and provision which is meeting the needs of all the people who want to hop on an e-bike, particularly older parts of society. So some of the things that we're looking at is we've got on our signs as you come into the city centre, the broad ambition and the statement that we are a cycling city. It's about really setting up front the ambition and being clear with that in our wording. What that means is that we have to invest a heck of a lot more funding in cycling infrastructure. We were the direct beneficiary of Andrew Gilligan coming and doing a cycling report on Oxford and the cycling needs that we have. And he basically indicated that the amount that we need to spend on cycling is far and away above what the county are currently spending, and far and away above what we're currently going to be getting from the government in the way of active travel funding to meet the emergency of the coronavirus. So it's about funding. We need to have government actually doing their fair share and contributing a sufficient amount per head on cycling. I think the Dutch spend something like £12 per head, whereas we spend something like £1. I think that's the figure that I saw recently. I think it's also about, as you say, the education and training. So bikeability is something that we promote within the city, particularly among the younger people in our city. How can we make sure that we keep on building that into people's education, particularly at a young age? How do we keep on reallocating road space, and what space is reallocated, is segregated and made safe for people? How do we make sure that the routes that we've got in the city aren't just this network of disjointed cycle lanes, but rather they all connect together so you can start and finish your journey? And then fundamentally for us, it's about thinking through the challenge of how do we use our arterial roads. In Oxford, we were in the 70s one of the first cities to trial park and rides. We actually were the first city in the UK to have a sustainable permanent park and ride presence. So we're working now to install cycle parking in the city, also at the park and ride, so we can promote pedal and park, or rather park and pedal. And we need to make sure that our arterial lanes are seeing proper segregated cycle lanes. And we're also working with our bus companies to make sure that on one of the key lanes that we can have the reallocation of road space, not just from cars to buses, but from buses to cyclists. And we think we can do that if we're able to help buses to flow more easily through our bus gates, because it avoids buses being stuck behind cars. And then when buses aren't stuck behind cars, the bus companies don't need to put on a third more buses to meet their timetables. So we have a third more buses which are half empty, just to help the bus companies to meet timetables. If we can get the right number of buses on our streets, we can not just help to have cycling infrastructure and cycling numbers go up, we also help the bus companies to have zero emissions buses, because they have to spend far less on the capital investments in that zero emission technology. So really, if you think about it, it's a win-win all around the transport loops.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think particularly in regards to road space reallocation, that's something we're already seeing a lot of at the moment up and down the country in cities, and we're definitely going to be seeing a lot more of. In Oxford City Council's recent survey, to which 191 organisations responded, including retailers, NHS institutions and university colleges, obviously a lot of high levels of support were identified for more secure cycling and road closures. I've got two questions relating to this. Firstly, what changes have you and the council sort of made in light of this feedback? And then also from a spatial perspective, the impact of COVID-19 has been massive and led to a new hierarchy of needs emerging in cities, and we've needed our infrastructure to evolve to reflect this and facilitate more social distancing. Therefore, how will road space reallocation improve social distancing and also pedestrian experiences of the city?
Yeah, so we've just announced recently two significant roads in Oxford city centre will be pedestrianised, and one has already just been pedestrianised. The benefits of this are clear because the people calling for it are our local businesses. They're struggling to serve the same number of people that they would before the pandemic because their premises are small and they need to keep people apart to protect them from the virus. So if we're able to have pedestrianisation of streets, we're then more able to support businesses to serve more people by having outdoors tables and chairs. And that's not just something which is beneficial for the local economy as we head through the toughest times, we'll know. And it's not just beneficial for businesses who are heading through the toughest times, they'll know, having been shuttered for months. It's not just beneficial for jobs, helping to keep businesses local and jobs local, because people are able to stay and work and do their hospitality work. It's actually also beneficial for social good. When we've all been locked down and we've gone through this unnatural period of being separated from each other, as humans, we're not built for that. We're built for connectivity. We're built for sociability. We're built for community. And when you're stripped from your community, your mental well-being is impacted. Your ability to get on with your life as you want to lead it is diminished, and your sense of agency and independence is stripped away from you. On a very deep philosophical level, I think the Labour Party ought to be promoting the filling of streets with tables and chairs, and with the promotion of outdoors cafe culture, because at this time it's a way to bring people together after a time of separation. It's a way of building and enriching community after a period of isolation. It's a way of creating belonging. And when you create that civic and that social capital, it doesn't just sustain people's well-being, it actually builds real communities of action. And we see this deliberately in Oxford. We've got a group now that's meeting on one of the pedestrianised streets that has come about because of the Citizens' Assembly on climate change. We had individuals who had never known each other, strangers, who I learned today are coming together for their coffees to talk about how they're going to take climate action forward. Not the council, how they're going to do it. Having been educated about the risks of climate breakdown, made more aware of what their own agency and power is, they're now saying, we want to crack on. And so they're going out, having their coffees, plotting how to take over the world, and thinking about how to build communities. That's perfect. That's beautiful. I think that's exactly what we ought to be striving for. And every great change, every great social upheaval that we've seen in Western Europe has more or less been traced back to the cafe. It's been about people coming together to air their differences, to debate, to come to consensus, to come to solutions, to plot, to take over the world. So let's keep doing that. And then in terms of what are the changes that we're making to promote that reallocation of road space and how to promote the pedestrian experience. It is through the promotion of 2 bus gates. So in the city centre, we've got a very tight network of narrow medieval roads. We were a city that during the Second World War was thankfully not bombed because Hitler intended to move the capital of his new empire to Oxford within England. And so we were spared the bombing raids that other cities had. So if you look at places like Southampton, for instance, they were completely rebuilt having been bombed, and they were built to meet the needs of the car. Oxford wasn't. We're very much a city which is cramming ever bigger cars into narrow streets. They're contesting the space that cyclists and pedestrians would use. And so with the promotion of bus gates, what we're trying to do is to limit the cut through by cars in the city centre, so that we don't just have a prevention of stop-and-go traffic of fossil fuel cars. It's also to allow our public transport to properly flow. So the bus companies are clear with us that when we reduce road speeds of their buses by 10%, we see an increase in their operating cost by around 6%. Now, where do those costs go? The 5.8% of extra costs go directly into the charges that customers and patrons have to pay in order to access their travel. If we want to have cheaper, more affordable bus services before we obviously get to mutualisation or nationalisation, then we, as a stopping stone, then we need to make sure that we're able to support buses to speed up that they're not putting on more bus services and numbers of buses on our roads than we need. And when they're not doing that, that they're able to properly invest in zero emissions technology, and they're able to hold or at least reduce their fares and provide cross-city travel. And we're also talking now with the government about how we implement their active travel fund on a really exciting network of cycle paths within the city and low traffic neighbourhoods. So in the east of the city in Cowley, we've got 3 low traffic neighbourhoods which are coming into being. There's now proposals for a further 7, including 1 in my own ward, which I'm very pleased about, which my residents have been calling for. But it's going to be a tough old challenge because people are addicted to the car. It's how they get around. It's convenient. It's where they exercise their control. They don't have to wait for a mode of travel to arrive. They leave when they want to. They return when they want to. It's their own safe space, which they operate within. To convince people that actually being stuck in stop-go traffic is not an exercise of control, it's not an exercise of agency, it's bad for their well-being, and to prove to them that there are other modes that they can shift onto, particularly more easily if we take away the dominance of the car on our roads, is a challenging fight to have. But that's why I think we need to have the Labour articulation of that argument. It's good for the environment, it's good for the air quality that we all need to breathe. It's particularly good when we know that there's a link between coronavirus and poor air quality, which disproportionately preys on the more vulnerable in our society and the more disadvantaged. And it's also just good for getting people around and building communities of belonging.
Yeah, I think you've raised some really interesting points there, particularly about people's dependency on the car, which sort of, as you say, we do need to move away from in our society. And I think people do have that connection with the car as almost an extension of themselves, as a sort of manifestation of their autonomy, and that isn't really something that's sustainable. So you've obviously sort of talked about the benefits of spatial reallocation in Oxford. How effectively do you think similar models have been elsewhere across the UK? And is it even possible to implement similar models, particularly in smaller cities with poorer interconnectivity and sort of difficulties with public transport, as you've mentioned, where people are definitely sort of part of that addicted to cars group?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look around the country now and see Labour in power at local government and just realise how much you achieve with power. Even when you're restricted in the funding available to you because government have cut your councils to the bone for the last 10 years and are refusing to honour their promises and their pledges to refill your coffers after asking you to do all that you can to stave off the worst of the pandemic. Even after that level of under-resourcing, Labour in power is achieving enormous things. So I was recently back home in Salford. I got to see what's happening by the Mayor of Salford there. Phenomenal stuff. Greater Manchester's combined authority and the Mayor are doing really great things. Southampton, I was recently in. They've got a whole new network of cycle lanes which are coming about because they've reduced the number of lanes dedicated to cars without any real significant impact on traffic flows, you've got to say. When I look at the London boroughs, I just cry with jealousy because you've got places like Hackney and Lambeth, which are just, doing amazing things. And I'm going to stop there because I realise that if I carry on talking about the great work of other councils, I'll inevitably not mention one council, which their councillor will get in touch with me about to complain about. So they're the best. Everyone else, you're doing great stuff too, but I'm not going to mention you in case I single out somebody who I didn't mention. We're doing really good stuff. What do we need in order to push that further? I think we need proper resourcing by government. We need the Labour Party nationally and in Parliament to be continuing to make a real focus of the transportation changes that need to be delivered. There needs to be a reckoning with the fact that local government is the vehicle for delivery of those. And so we need to be always trumpeting the power of local government to make change happen. We need to be thinking about this in the context of the government's attempts to abolish certain types of councils. So the local government reorganization plans which are being pushed forward at pace by the government without very much consultation and all for cost cutting or to actually help entrench Tory rule in parts of the country are all devastating to local government that is led by Labour. We need to be having our national party speaking up on that for a whole array of reasons, but specifically for environmental and transportation reasons. And we also need to be thinking about not just how we achieve change at the borough level, the big city level, but as you say, also at the very local level. And the one area where I will agree with the county Tories when they talk about the need to think about the whole county of Oxfordshire is when they say that actually we represent rural communities. How are we going to be able to get the people that we represent into and out of the city? How do we link rural and urban communities, dense and less dense populations? And I think the answer there is holistic, integrated thinking. I mean, the proposal I always make to the county Tories is, well, you could always reinstate some of the bus services you cut. You could always support the extension of people-powered bus services, like in Witney, where we've got a cooperative which is running a fantastic bus service, which is set up by a fantastic Labour cooperator councillor. You could always explore funding and investment in electric bikes and electric scooters. You could have installation of electric vehicle charging points at park and rides, so that people could feel comfortable moving from their home in an EV, if they have to drive, down to the park and ride, park it there, charge it, and then be able to get into the city either by biking in on the arterial cycle lanes that we construct, or by the bus service that we provide as part of our park and ride, or even by using electric bikes. We're increasingly looking at how we can invest in charging and securitization infrastructure, and we're very hopeful that we'll be able to do that. And it makes sense to, because Oxford is the home of the e-bike summit. We're now in our second and third year, and we've had manufacturers and experts coming into the city on a routine basis to share their experiences and calling on Oxford to make real investments in this in partnership with government.
I think that's sort of really interesting, and again, sort of a testament to the really great work that yourself and the council have been doing in Oxford. And obviously there's also been the kind of strong public support for some of the initiatives that have been put into place, which is really great. This month in Islington, London, there have actually been protests urging Islington Council to reverse the plans that they've put in place for low traffic neighbourhoods. The power to implement what has been called the people-friendly streets scheme was granted to local authorities by government in new legislation, which was brought in to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 and facilitate social distancing. But some of the protesters are concerned that the scheme could actually increase congestion and also is creating more space for cyclists, but this is at the expense of elderly people and disabled people. How can we ensure that disabled and elderly people are not excluded from plans where city space is being reallocated, and also that access is maintained to ensure that the new normal, which is an expression I'm sure we all hope by now, is as inclusive as possible?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'm Chief Executive for Mental Health and Complex Needs Charity. I've worked in the mental health sector for a while. I used to work at Scope, a disability charity. And my passion for creating a more accessible world is very much born out of the fact that both of my parents were disabled. And so I grew up, as I've always been their carer, but I've been the person who's been responsible for achieving their mobility. And so this is something which really, really sticks with me. Actually, the more I think about it, I hadn't realized this question was coming up, but I've got, if you can see it, it's a badge which basically says rights for disabled people now. And it's from 1995 when disabled campaigners were fighting for accessibility on the bus networks. And they were fighting what became the Disability Discrimination Act, although they were fighting for a Disability Rights Civil Rights Act. And I think, the campaign for disabled rights goes on. There is not a Disabled Civil Rights Act. There is a complete disregard by government for the needs and rights of disabled people. And I think it's on Labour to make sure that we extend equality to all. And we particularly do that where we're in power, which is local government. So one of the things that we've done in Oxford is to set up an inclusive transportation forum. We did that straight off the bat. It was helped to be set up by a councillor, cabinet member who is herself disabled, who I work really closely with, which again shows the importance of looking at the communities that you serve and having policies in places as a Labour Party to make sure that you bring everybody from all backgrounds into the council that you want to serve on and do good through. And the Inclusive Transportation Group is phenomenal. It's a weekly meeting with officers from the city and the county councils, with citizens who have a range of physical impairments and disabilities and mental ill health conditions. And we go to them with really meaty issues. We ask them about pedestrianisation, we ask them about bus gates, we ask them about cycling infrastructure, and we get their feedback, and they see things that we just don't see. They can help us to fix problems that would have been put into place had we not consulted them. And it's been absolutely fantastic. I think it's an example of best practice that we need to be exporting more and more around local government, because there's a great phrase in disability rights campaigning, which is nothing about us without us. And they've got a second phrase, which is I'm not going to say it out loud, but it's the PISS on pity phrase. They want engagement, they want inclusion, they want to be able to share their views, and councils should be providing opportunities for that. And then I think you raise a really good question here about democracy and managing change, because it's tempting, isn't it, when we're in a moment of opportunity which we see potentially closing, and we see a need to act quickly. It's tempting to move at pace and to do that in a way which is quite top down. But that concerns me, because when you do that, you don't take people with you. You don't create the opportunities for improvement of your policy by listening to people's experiences. You potentially impose things which actually run counter to what people want, counter to what they need. And so you store up a heck of a lot of problems, but also antagonism. And we all know that we need to reduce the number of fossil fuel vehicles on our roads. We all know that we need to take people on that journey. But we need to see the largest proportion of change to achieve decarbonisation coming from individuals. It's not from organisations, it's not just from businesses, it's from individuals. So if we're to achieve zero carbon citizens, we need to work with people to actually build up those strengths and those areas of improvement. We can't just impose it on them. And so this isn't a comment on Islington. I know the specifics around the Islington case. They're completely right as a council to be doing what they're doing. And I love the leader, Richard Watts's sort of taunt of the opponents saying, we'll see you in the 2022 elections, because he's right. We should be brave and stand on a manifesto and a track record of delivery. But we also do need to be thinking about how we work with our communities. And each community will be different. Each local authority area will be different. But we need to be talking, consulting, and making change happen. And that was why we had the Citizens' Assembly on climate change, because we wanted to hear from a representation of viewpoints and backgrounds, and we want to take people with us by embedding and extending democracy, not by moving at a top-down approach at pace and without very much consideration for the lives that people lead.
Yeah, completely. And I think sort of what you've said about sort of making sure people are taken on the journey and that they don't feel like something is happening to them, but it's happening for them, is really important. Just going to have one last question from me before we throw it open to the floor for a Q&A, and it kind of links quite neatly onto what we were talking about. There's been a lot of work going on at the moment from global leaders and urban planners on the interconnection between cities and mental health. It's been identified that the city can provide overwhelming stimuli through density, noise, crowds, pollution, and the intensity of all of these factors and more can often make people feel overloaded, which can cause stress. And this can also encourage people to retreat into private spaces and reject social connections that can promote good mental health. It's been suggested that we need to have some smarter urban design and spatial reallocation in cities, which can help address and mitigate these issues. How would you say policymakers can therefore support urban designers in creating these city spaces that help to promote improved public mental health and well-being?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. I think I'd start the answer to the question by building in the common assumption, which is that everyone talks about a parity between physical and mental health, but actually, when you look at government policy and you look at the funding streams they've put in place and the architecture around mental health service delivery, there is no sense of a parity between mental health and physical health. And that's ridiculous. Everybody has mental health. 1 in 4 will experience mental ill health at some point in their lives. And it just so happens that the people who will be more prone to experiencing that will be the people who are in different types of poverty, different types of disadvantage. So the argument I would make is that we recognise that mental health is important, that we recognise that despite the warm words, there's not very much action which supports that noble intention, and that we come up as a Labour Party with a set of policies which try to properly put mental health into the public health architecture, and we properly reconfigure the delivery of mental health services by the clinical commissioning groups, by local councils, by Public Health England, by the voluntary sector, in a way which is joined up. And to do that, you need to have service users properly contributing their views to what makes good mental health and what that service delivery would look like. And I'm pretty sure, wearing my hat as a counsellor, but also wearing my hat as a chief executive for a mental health charity, that there would be extraordinary commonalities between the conversations that those different bodies are having on this particular topic. So people feel better when they can get well-being and physical exercise sources. So how can we make sure that we provide spaces for people to be able to exercise? How do we ensure that green spaces are very and we also know we actually enhance and extend biodiversity. And so I'd be thinking those things through. Decarbonisation agenda that we pursue, much as actually and community exclusion as key goals that we consider when we're Hello? Hello, I slightly lost you there.
You broke up for me a little bit there at the end of that, sorry.
Oh, I was just saying that I would have for the council a really clear set of outcomes that you want to achieve for people's mental health, and that when you have that very much in your horizon as you're delivering all of your decarbonisation goals, that's how you actually deliver those mental health outcomes through your decarbonisation policies.
Yeah, completely. Very much agree with that. And I do sort of really think making sure that those points are clear and deliverable, as you say, is sort of key to actually getting the action that's required. So going to open up to the floor now for a Q&A. We've already got a few questions in the Q&A tab, so thank you very much for everybody that's put those in. Please feel free to add in any more as we go through. I'm going to start with a question from an anonymous attendee. Says, what else can we do to ensure that the cities of the future don't exclude groups who don't or can't participate in active travel?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the argument I would make about you can't bypass democracy when you're coming up with solutions, and that's a particularly salient question to ask at a time of perceived emergency responsiveness to the pandemic. How do you make sure that you're not just acting at the appropriate pace to deliver major changes demanded by government and to an extent funded by it, but how do you do it in a way which is open, inclusive and accessible, and particularly takes into account the viewpoints of people who might be disadvantaged by some of the changes you make? The experience we've got, the councillors that you set up for, which bring those people specifically into the council. So we've got the Inclusive Transport Forum, we've got an Older Persons Forum and an Older Persons Champion who is very much in contact with the voluntary sector groups and older people in the city to hear their views on the changes we want to make. I think as much as possible, consult publicly on the changes you want to make. The Bus Gates consultation saw 7,000 responses, and we know that we got a very large number from the voluntary sector who have a huge amount of contact with the types of groups that would ordinarily be disadvantaged by transportation changes. And I think the other solution, which is slightly medium to longer term, is that you have a Labour group in each of these local authority areas, which looks like the people it serves, that you have really strong and robust policies to have a diverse group. Because when you have a group which really looks the same and thinks the same and says the same thing, you're kind of paralysing yourself. You're not really progressing anything. And you look like the city of history, not the city of the future.
With that, yeah, I think again, the point about consultation in particular is really important, and sort of again, making sure that people don't feel blindsided by any changes that are happening to them and kind of transforming their spaces. We've just had another anonymous question in, which is quite interesting. It says, do we need to think about different cycle lanes for different traffic, i.e. dispatch riders students alongside slower leisure cyclists who might be less confident on the roads?
I think in principle it's a fantastic idea. I think it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution across all the local authority areas. In Oxford, I would love for that to be the case, but it's just not going to happen. We're already fighting as hard as we can to have segregated space for cyclists of any variety, let alone cyclists who may be zero emissions businesses, and we have those in the city. We've got two phenomenal examples of zero emissions businesses that cycle all over, and actually a lot of their profitability is based on the fact that they aren't stuck in traffic jams. They can get to people faster. So these businesses are Pedal and Post, who deliver, for instance, blood to the local hospitals really quickly, as well as your regular post. And also a company called Oxwash that pick up people's laundry and then go away to their base, wash it really ethically and sustainably, and then return it pretty much within an hour or two to people's homes. And Oxford is a place which is of a size where if you pull on a lever, you can more or less see change happen quite quickly. And that's why we've been able to progress a lot of our zero emissions ambitions, whether that be the zero emission zone, which is coming in from next year, which restricts polluting vehicles coming into the city centre, requires our Hackney cab fleet to move to completely zero emissions by 2025, and takes our bus companies on a zero emissions journey, which involves them being Euro 6 diesel this year. 115 buses have just been retrofitted to be Euro 6. And then also requires them to be zero emissions capable by 2030, although we expect that to be a lot sooner. I think it would be great to be able to kind of have that sort of segregated space for particular types of journeys, but I think in a city like Oxford it's going to be hard, and I think it would be conditional on the layout of roads and the network of roads within other local authority areas. Although I think in London boroughs this could work really well.
Nice, thank you very much. That's great, thank you. We've got a question from Vari. I'm going to try and unmute you, so I will just press that. Vari, can you ask your question for us?
Sure. Hi, Tom. I was wondering, from your experience of doing the citizens' assemblies in Oxford, were you surprised by the amount of support that there was for climate action, in this case, sort of active travel? And do you think Labour generally underestimates the amount of public support that there is for measures like this?
I think that's a really good question, and the fact I'm grinning as much as I am is an indication of the fact that I'm receiving emails from Labour members and my fellow Labour councillors about the transportation changes that we want to take through. Because quite rightly, we've got a group and a party which represents a whole range of viewpoints and backgrounds, and so they're speaking up for what they're hearing from some of their residents. But actually, when you look at what the broad representation of the whole city is saying, they are positive about the changes that we're proposing and want to introduce. The consultation response on the two bus gates saw 7,000 responses. It's not a referendum, but were it to be a referendum, we would have seen support for the bus gates and all the causes and the vision we're outlining. We were very clear in making a proactive case about the kind of society we want to build, rather than focusing narrowly in on the detail of the bus gates or rebutting our opponents' arguments. I think any Labour councillor or any Labour member in this meeting will have people in their group or in their party who are suspicious or cynical or hostile about changes that could be transformative. And I think meeting them where they are to challenge their assumptions if it's appropriate and working with them wherever possible will be key. And then the question about the Citizens' Assembly. So I think I would discourage, and I can't believe that I'm saying this now, whereas I wouldn't have said it 4 or 5 months ago. I think given the state of underfunding that local councils are about to experience from the government, I can't see this wave of citizens' assemblies that started being sustained into the future. I think people will ask, why are you spending an amount of money on consulting and engaging when you could spend that money on the actions that we all need to be taken to decarbonise? And I think that's a real shame. I think we were just starting to get going with a new experiment in local government and robust democracy. I think we're always going to have representative democracy, that's the right thing. But this particular form of participatory democracy was really yielding in the places which have held citizens' assemblies or pushing on with them very specific insights into the needs of particular communities and representation of those communities. And particularly on the case of active travel, we had really strong support from our assembly to go further and faster. And when I look at the key highlights from our assembly, there was a strong encouragement for behaviour change and modal shift away from the private car. There was a desire for a unified strategy from all the different partners that are involved in providing it. And there was a real desire for the incentivisation of public transport. When we asked a specific question about what change do you think government should make, the question that we put was, the government having already legislated to end the sale of fossil fuel vehicles from 2040, should they bring that forward to 2030? We had 35 out of our Citizens Assembly members saying, yes, that ought to happen. And the frustration wasn't just about the fact that it wasn't happening. It was that this was a decision which could just be done. If you were already doing it in 2040, why not do it sooner? It just made sense. They wanted a stroke of the pen decision. And I guess the final thing I'd say about the Citizens Assembly was that it doesn't always yield you the results you expect. So we thought that by the process of education, through 27 expert speakers over a whole weekend, and then a whole further weekend of dialogue and debate, and having aired differences and opened up dialogue, started to reach decisions, that we would see real support for the measures we were proposing. But it cut two ways. The first was that while we had about 75% of the Assembly in favour of action, we always had a solid quarter that wasn't in favour of going faster than the government's target of 2050. The view being that 2050 was already too hard, why would you go faster? And then it also cuts a different way, because the person who came into the Assembly at the start of the process, who was the most enthusiastic about climate action, who had an Extinction Rebellion badge on, who would go out and protest, who had been arrested numerous times, and by the end of the process actually was among the more cynical. They felt that actually they'd learned a lot about climate, and they felt it was too complex to go faster. And they felt after a decade of austerity and sacrifice, it wasn't fair to ask people to have even more sacrifice and austerity. And I think that's just really worth sort of taking account of. People can surprise you, and we need to be prepared to be surprised.
It's great, thank you. I think, yeah, really interesting question, and definitely completely appreciate your point about sort of people's perspectives potentially sort of transitioning as they sort of experience the Assembly, and the kind of the characters that you think will be the most engaged, not actually that sort of working out. That's quite interesting. We've had a series of questions from the chair of the Environment Network, Jack. I think there's a really good question on funding. So Jack, I'm going to unmute you. Right, Jack, if you want to ask a question. Hello.
Hi, Tom. So yeah, you've talked a few times, I think, about the costs and the lack of funding for these projects. I think we can probably expect council budgets are not going to be massively increased in the short term. So I wanted to sort of ask where else that funding might come from. Is there potential for private investment if those projects could increase, you know, footfall in retail areas, or otherwise benefit private investors?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, the real risk that we face is that the councils, particularly those run by Labour, which are most at threat, are at threat because government want to move decision making further away from a local level, to have ever larger councils, but to still probably give them the same amount of money. And so you've got coming up over the next year a real risk of the main vehicle for action in government, being local government, being disadvantaged because it's further away from our communities and it's not given any extra resource to do what it needs to do to meet the government's quite tight ambition of 2050. And the Committee on Climate Change were quite clear about that at the time of their last report. So where does the money come from? So in Oxford, we deliberately, at the time of the onset of austerity 10 years or so ago, invested in our sustainability team. And we did that because, first of all, it's Oxford, so we knew that we were going to have a city that was wanting to prioritise that. It was the right and democratic thing to do. But it was also because we saw that actually, if we continue to build our profile and our track record in meeting the climate crisis, we could help to bring investment into the city, which could probably help to fund the salaries of some of our council officers. And I think that has been a strategy which has paid off. So Oxford has got a sustainability team of 18 people, which is pretty big. But a large number of those people are actually working to achieve the council's aims using private money. So we've got investment of around £81 million in just 2 projects within Oxford and Oxfordshire, which the City Council played a key role in securing the money for, and is also playing a key role in delivering. One is called the Energy Super Hub Oxford, which is what I call the BBB, much to the annoyance of the PR company behind Pivot Power, who are leading on the battery. It's a big bloody battery. It's enormous. It will provide enormous amounts of renewable energy supply. It's linked up to renewable energy generation. It provides energy for 300 homes through heat pumps, which are controlled by people's smartphones. It allows for the installation of rapid electric vehicle charging and less rapid electric vehicle charging in the hundreds in our Redbridge Park and Ride. It's allowing for the transformation of the City Council's fleet. So this year we're taking in 80 electric vehicles or electric vehicles of some size, including our first refuse truck. And it's also allowing for a huge investment in the local economy through procurement of local businesses. And one business that we're procuring is a social enterprise that we helped set up 10 years ago called the Low Carbon Hub, which through £6 million worth of loans, 3 loans over the last 10 years, we've helped to build into a profitable social enterprise, which means that people through shareholder offerings will invest in the Low Carbon Hub. It will then invest in renewable energy projects, which pay back a dividend to the people investing, but also means that we're sending less of our money out of the county to the big six, which are more or less oligarchical organisations. It's an example of the council putting its heart on its sleeve and wearing its values and achieving social good. And the other big project we're bringing in is called Project Leo, which is the local energy system, which will help to develop smart energy systems in Oxfordshire and Oxford, working with the university and private investors. And that's helping us to understand better about the supply, demand and generation of energy. And hopefully this will be a template for around the country in other local authority areas. I don't think that the future of decarbonisation could be rested upon local government finance. I think we have a really powerful role to play as councils in bringing money in, facilitating conversations, convening. And I recognise that not every city will have the University of Oxford and that knowledge and research on its doorstep, but we all have really great universities. And those universities are, to use the parlance of community wealth building, anchored institutions. The University of Oxford can't leave Oxford because it's got the name Oxford in its title. So how do we rope them in? How do we help them to bring investment in? And how do we use that to pursue our own council aims and our own social good, not just here, but in the other parts of the country, which have got their own universities, their own knowledge clusters, their own businesses, their own potential investors.
Yeah, completely. I think the point about sort of those institutions and the kind of existing sort of power and status they have is sort of really useful to have them on board as advocates. I've seen a question from Will about biodiversity that I don't think we've actually touched on that much thus far. So Will, I'm just going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I will.
Hi, so really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for everything so far. I think it's really interesting that there was quite a large focus on pedestrianisation, zero emission and zero congestion zones, which is great. But I was interested how much your council is able to focus or is focusing on potential natural-based solutions or biodiversity measures as well.
Yeah, so the Citizens Assembly looked at 5 themes, and we used those themes after looking at the carbon emissions in our city through a report that we commissioned. And biodiversity and offsetting was one of the themes looked at by the Citizens Assembly. And I'll be honest with you, it kind of almost fell off. We thought that over 2 weekends, working to a really tight agenda with Ipsos Mori, our facilitators, we could only pack so much in, but we really pushed to include biodiversity. And it was by far one of the best decisions we took, because it really brought out in that room, among a range of viewpoints and backgrounds, the sense of enthusiasm for tangible change making. Transportation can feel icky and tricky. Housing feels overwhelming and complex. Oxford's carbon problem is overwhelmingly a housing and buildings problem. 81% of our emissions comes from buildings. But biodiversity felt accessible. Everybody knows a green space, everybody would use or enjoy a green space, and everybody recognised that biodiversity extension was something which could help to create communities, not just between people who would ordinarily get stuck into this and this sort of activity, but also newer people, people who need to kind of better understand why we want to pursue decarbonisation and why we're wanting to also generally pursue economic and social justice through our decarbonisation approach. And so what we've done with the biodiversity approach is to really give it a bit of a kickstart from where it was. We already had tree cover, which was double that in London, but that hadn't happened in any way, shape or form by the City Council. It happened of its own accord. So what we're doing is working with the other districts within Oxfordshire, as well as Oxfordshire County Council, to come up with a natural capital partnership, which will bring in funding from all of those organisations, and it will make sure that we extend biodiversity into the parts of the county where it can have the maximum impact from a decarbonisation, but also a social good point of view. We've got a Youth Climate Summit, which is happening at the end of this year, which will have biodiversity really focused on that, to have a sense of the importance of it to younger people in our city. Because we're thinking about which communities can particularly take a lead on particular areas of decarbonisation. If younger people and children have a particular enthusiasm for this, we really want to help them and empower and give them agency so they can push forward their goals around biodiversity, which aren't just about them being delivery vehicles for the council, but actually setting their own goals. We want to work with them to co-produce what our biodiversity outcomes should look like. And I think it's also worth saying that when we go back to the argument about mental health, we know that the greener the green, the better the mental health. So how do we really connect the biodiversity goals, not just to decarbonisation, but our wider public health goals? And I think the very final thing that I would say around this is that we have seen a real tension in Oxford, where we're a city of a limited size. We can only meet a certain proportion of our housing need through the homes that we build within our city boundaries. So much more of our housing need has to be built outside of the city. So there's a real tension in Oxford between using our land that we own or that we can access for new housing or for planting green spaces. But what we came to was a conclusion that through our local plan, which has just been approved, we would have a very heavy extension of biodiversity for every extension of our home building and every extension of our building generally.
Thank you. That was a really interesting question. Really great to hear as well about all the work that the council are doing in terms of biodiversity. We've got an interesting question in terms of international comparisons from Charlie. So Charlie, I'm just going to unmute you now.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Tom. Hey, Tom, how's it going? So my question is, we know that there's lots of amazing work that's done, not only in pockets of the UK, but also Northern Western Europe, whether it's Utrecht, Groningen, Ghent, Paris has done quite a lot recently. We know corners of London, Manchester, like you mentioned, Birmingham. Broadly speaking, what can we learn from other cities across Northern Europe with a sort of what works perspective, and then also looking at donut economics, how Amsterdam has adopted that and Copenhagen is adopting it as well. And is that something that UK cities could also potentially adopt? Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. I just want to say this is a testament to the persistence and the tenacity and the wonderfulness of Oxford climate activists. Charlie is a very well-known person. He's brilliant. And during the Busgates consultation, he basically staffed a storefront in Oxford City, organised by himself in the campaign group that he works on, to provide information to people about what the Busgates were and what a vision of a future transport system would look like. And I think that's important because it gets to the importance of building community and activism and belonging. So it's nice to see Charlie on the call. I think the simple answer to your question, Charlie, is what can we learn? We can learn that it wins you votes. If you look at the electoral success of the authorities and the administrations that pushed through really bold transportation changes in those places, they saw the payback and the dividend in significant measure when it came to the ballot box. And I think it's important for us to always convey that to some of our Labour members or our councillors who may be more reluctant, more cautious, even a little bit cynical, and may think that if you listen to the loudest people who often shout on Twitter, then you're probably going to be seeing a very narrow viewpoint. So constantly making that point is important. I think it's also important to keep on strengthening our internationalist credentials. So in Oxford, we are twinned with a whole number of cities, ranging from Lyon to Ramallah. And we need to be making sure that those twinning arrangements aren't just council to local authority, they're actually very much coming from friendships, links and grassroots and communities. And the reason we twin with those authorities or those cities is because we already have those links to build up the city and the council levels. So how do we use those links to also make sure that what is good for Utrecht and which is good for Ghent is also good for Oxford? How do we facilitate dialogue at the community level, not just at the elected official level? And then I think the very final thing to say is that it's not the case anymore that national governments will solve our problems. What will solve our problems is a world of cities and a world of communities. And so the more that we can build dialogue and linkages and communities at a trans and cross-city local authority level, the more we can achieve success. And that's why the City Council in Oxford has invested not just heavily in our twinning relationships, but also very directly in our membership and involvement of key international groupings of cities like C40 and the Covenant of Mayors, and also UK 100 within the UK. And I would encourage cities and local authority areas to do the same, to believe that actually you can achieve most when you're in power. And when you're in power, you can achieve most when you're working with other like-minded individuals and trying to convert those who aren't so open to your ideas, to your cause, in an open, democratic, inclusive way, but always championing Labour values and principles. And ultimately, in the long run, seeing the electoral success that will come because of that at the local level and the national level.
Absolutely, I think a really strong question there and another really interesting answer. And again, sort of completely agree with your point, Tom, that it all goes back to sort of making sure that we can get Labour in power at a local level, at national level, and just ensuring that the work that needs to be done to create these more sustainable communities can take place. We've had another interesting question from Alex. I'm just going to you now, Alex. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Hi, Laura. Hi, Tom. How you doing? Tom, I really agreed with what you were saying about the bottom-up approach that we need to be taking. Like I work in international development, and like it's the approach that we always take. We always have to consult, especially disabled groups. So but in the interest of this approach, and especially just in light of the reduction in funding of local government that is forthcoming, what role can NGOs and civil society organisations play in achieving the goal of sustainable cities, especially in partnership with government?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I work in the voluntary sector. I used to work in campaigns at Oxfam and Scope, and have moved more into roles which focus on strategy development and kind of business development for charities. And I think the learning that I've got from wearing both voluntary sector and council hats is that voluntary organisations and NGOs should speak truth to power. We have seen a government in the last 10 years introduce legislation which has intimidated and intended to intimidate charities. And so the campaigning power of those organisations has been limited because they have muted themselves in order not to fall onto the wrong side of what they perceive to be the law. That is the wrong thing to do. If we're talking about a bottom-up approach, if we're talking about communities of belonging and the idea that airing difference gets you to a better place, and being fine with that and being fine to engage in difficult conversations, then NGOs need to be part of that. They need to be raising their voices and have the confidence to do it. And if anybody on this call works for an NGO or has a loved one who does, or knows a random person they meet at the bus stop who does, please urge them to have the NGO raise their voice to power, whether it's in local or national levels. And I think then looking at the other side of the equation, what role does government at local and national levels have to embrace NGOs? I think they have a role to respect the independence of NGOs. That just because an NGO criticised doesn't mean you should shut them out or ignore them. They've got service user engagement, they've got experience, they've got probably decades of existence, which means that they've got really rich insights to bring to the table. Use that. Be open, be thoughtful, be considerate, be solicitous of their views. Because I guarantee you that there's not a single person in local government, there's not a single person in national government, there's not anyone on this call who has all the answers all the time. But we have it within ourselves, if we come together, all of the answers to actually fix all of our problems. We just need to have that collectivist approach. And I think the other thing that local and national government ought to do in relationship to NGOs is to actually think about them not just as a kind of obstacle or as something to consult at the last moment, if at all, but to think of them as active partners. So what we have done in Oxford is to launch a charter for cleaner air with Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and also Greenpeace UK. It's the first form of cooperation of a local council with any campaigning groups. And the charter has 10 asks that we ask of government to secure cleaner air, which means that we minimise the health impacts of air pollution and also minimise the impacts that air polluting causes can have on climate breakdown. And that has now been signed by a number of South East councils because it's the idea that actually NGOs have a lot of experience and expertise to shape the charter pledges. A form of cooperation can actually bring voices together in a powerful chorus between Oxford and those organisations. But then when you add to that other councils' voices, you could build an even greater, a more, a stronger collective of voices that you can marshal and raise to government. And the experience I've got that I'll close with is I know what it's like to sit across from ministers. I know what it's like to sit across from Boris Johnson and to try and brief him on Yemen and how UK arms sales are actually directly causing death in Yemen. They're not very well briefed people. If you go to them with compelling arguments that are based on evidence and the views of people who really know their stuff, you can probably in the course of an hour help to shift their minds. You just have to go prepared. You need to be bold and brave and hopefully have a better audience than Boris Johnson, but more or less you can make change happen.
Absolutely. I think we'll just take one more question, which I think should sort of really neatly tie off into everything we've been talking about today in terms of the changes that we need to make in light of COVID-19. So James, I'm just going to unmute you now. And Tom, if you can sort of wrap up any final closing remarks in this question, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you, and hi Tom, and thank you for your time this evening. Yeah, I think a lot of people really haven't quite grasped just how big the potential changes are that are sort of amounting from COVID-19 and the pandemic. And obviously a lot of people are working from home at the moment and they haven't gone back into their offices, which obviously is quite interesting. And I'm back in, but there's only 3 or 4 people in my team out of 20 odd, just to give you an example. So is there a role for cities in the future? Will we see office blocks being converted to residential properties? And if the future isn't that, then should we be investing in the surrounding towns and suburbs if this is where people are going to be spending the majority of their time in future?
It's a really good question. I think when it's hard to do at a time of emergency to think through the medium to longer term impacts of the decisions you're taking when actually you're so focused on saving lives and providing ways to save lives. But I think increasingly it is the role of local government to think through how it performs its role as a placemaker. So how it can make sure that the changes it brings in now are as much as possible contribute to the kind of society we want to bring, which bases itself on the assumption that local councils will have done that legwork in their manifesto development and their development of their policies. But also thinks through what some of the challenges coming down the line are. Nobody could have, at the start of the year, we could have predicted that coronavirus would happen because we had the signs, but we ignored them. But nobody a year or so ago would have predicted that a pandemic might hit us, although we always thought it was a possibility. I think now is the time to do some really deep digging into what the risks are in the future, but also how we convert those into opportunities. By nature, I'm a hopeful person, not always optimistic, but hopeful. And if you're able to come up with an action plan and a really strong set of goals that you want to achieve, and then you match that to the vision of the society you want to achieve, you can pretty much prepare for anything. And so when you talk about what will our cities look like, the smartest thing I remember hearing now was said to me 5 years ago by somebody who worked in retail who said, the future isn't in office blocks. We should stop building office blocks because people are going to start working from home to meet the climate crisis. Now, as it happens, people are working from home to meet the pandemic, but they'll soon in time start to also work from home to meet the climate crisis. Working from home has shown us, 2 things. First of all, that we miss each other, but also we can get a lot done when we're not with each other. So how do we actually draw a balance between that? How do we make sure we're traveling less so we can be more efficient with our time, but also how do we make sure that we're connecting enough with each other face to face so we're actually able to read each other's verbal cues and really have that effective interaction? What will happen to office blocks if they're underused? Can we turn them into housing? Do we need to have the building of large office blocks or even medium-sized ones? Could we rethink what we turn that space over to, whether it's green space or housing? What happens to retail? What happens to our transportation system when we increasingly see electric, autonomous and connected and digital transportation? I think these are all the sorts of things that we need to be thinking through right now. And I think I'll close just by saying, I've urged caution and I've urged democracy and dialogue, because I think the society that we have a chance to bring into being now is a society that we've been wanting to bring into being for a long time. Labour in power at the national level is a very rare thing. It's something to hold on to for every second to treasure. And when we get into power, to make sure we make absolutely the most of. And all the thinking that we do now, all the changes that we make now are going to improve our societies in the time we live in and hopefully in the future. But they're also drawing up a really rich set of outcomes we want to achieve when we finally get our hands on levers of national power. And when we do get our hands on those levers, we need to make sure that every second of every minute of every hour of every day is used to advance our purpose, because when Labour governments are so rare, we owe it to ourselves to be the best prepared we can be, and when we're in government, to make the absolute most of being in power. So let's really crack on. Let's make change at the local level through our councils. Let's keep on winning council seats and councils at the next all-out elections. Let's go out and campaign and make sure that we can keep on keeping Labour in local government. But let's also come up with real visions for what we want to achieve for Labour in power at the local level and the national power. Let's do it consultatively and democratically and inclusively. Let's really talk with people and recognise that we can't be purist about either completely protecting the car or completely banning the car. But let's also just get out there and make change happen.
Completely, and I think that's a really sort of great message of hope, but also positive action that we can sort of tie things up here tonight. So thank you so much, Tom. You've definitely left us with some really great food for thought about how we can make our cities more sustainable in future. Thank you very much to everybody that's joined. Quick plug for some upcoming Young Fabians activity. Mark from the Young Fabians Exec is hosting a discussion on the Tories' planning revolution. What does it mean for us? Which will feature experts with backgrounds in local authorities, campaign groups and the non-profit sector. That's going to be on Thursday, 27th of August at 6:30, so one not to be missed. From the Environment Network's point of view, we're preparing for the launch of our upcoming report on international accountability for the climate crisis. So stay tuned, check out our social channels, follow us on Twitter at EnvironmentYF, check us out on Facebook, and email us if you have any questions about any of that. Finally, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all of you for joining, for providing us with your questions, which instigated some really insightful discussion. And also a massive thank you to Tom for taking up his time to be with us tonight for all of his insights. Hope that you all have a lovely Tuesday evening, and thank you very much again for joining us. See you later. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.